And I go back to my very early days in school when I did well in art and I did well in math. And I went to the headmaster of my school and I said, because I do well in art and I do well in math, I will study architecture. And he looked at me and said something that went right over my head. In fact, it took me 10 years to understand what he said. He said, I like gray suits and I like pinstriped suits, but I don't like gray pinstripe suits. And it completely escaped me. I went to architecture school and I realized many years later that for me, the combination of art and technology was computers, not architecture. And so I looked now, more recently, back at my own career and the career of people who have been with me for the past 35, 40 years, and I asked myself, where do new ideas come from? And there are really four places. But the biggest is differences. They come from differences. And that is so important because a homogeneous society is not an innovative society. That's very important to remember. If you are a homogeneous society, it's much harder. And people look at the United States and say all the innovation or a lot of innovation is coming from there. It's because it's full of differences. It's a heterogeneous society. And the second ingredient is that there are all these unlikely juxtapositions. That things you don't expect to go together suddenly do. And one of the reasons that's important to remember is that our world, our schooling, our entire education system is based on likely juxtapositions, not the unlikely ones. And third of all, it's very important, and this is more for the corporate world, to keep looking outside. There's such a temptation to look inside. Especially in a big corporation where you have half the people in the corporation managing the other half. And then the half who are being managed are spending half of their time being managed. So you end up in a big corporation with less than 25% of the net energy of humans to be innovative because everybody's managing or being managed. So it's very important to look outside and then to remember, last of all, that discipline is not your friend. Sometimes it takes very undisciplined, very chaotic environments for the innovation to happen. And I'm going to share with you, to me, the most important piece of advice I can give to somebody in the room is that incrementalism is your enemy. Incrementalism, when somebody tells you go step by step, wrong. Incrementalism is not your friend. You have to look to the side. You have to do things that are, in fact, not incremental at all. So I'm going to give you an example, and I'm reaching back 40 years. This slide is 40 years old. Image. 40 years ago, I don't want to call it a dream, I had a belief that the way people would interact with computers 40 years later would be by touching. People thought that was stupid. So stupid that people wrote technical papers about how stupid it was to touch a computer. And one of these papers came up with very scientific reasons, except for the third one, which I'll mention in a moment, as to why it would be bad and it wouldn't work. One of the reasons was that if you used your fingers would block what you were touching. You couldn't see through your fingers. Another reason was that your fingers were very low resolution, and so you couldn't touch small things. And the third reason, which was the funniest, was that if you used your fingers, you would get the screen dirty. My reason for saying that is that many years later, it's one of the most common interface, and it is something that you just have to do, see, and guess what, touch. And people slowly, one of the first people to really buy into this was Steve Jobs. And I knew Steve very well, and he said, well, Nicholas, won't it get the screen dirty? And I said, no, Steve. It'll actually, if the screen is dirtier than your finger, it'll clean the screen. And so, touch moves on. I think there are trends, global, worldwide trends, that are making innovation much more possible. Much more possible than it was in my time, partly because there is a general respect for disruption. Disruption is good. Disruption used to be bad. The word itself suggests that you're disrupting, and yet now it's actually good. Another thing that's very important is that I know people who have spent lifetimes in investment banking and retire, very successful investment bankers. And I meet them at a cocktail party and they say to me, oh, let me tell you about my work in the Peace Corps. I said, Peace Corps, that was 30, 40 years ago. Yes, but that was the important part and had the most meaning, and now that I've retired, I will start doing meaningful things again. And there used to be, much more than today, there used to be this belief that you used your life to do things you didn't really like to do, to make money, to then do what you really like to do. And the mixture between making money and doing meaningful things was a very stark one. Very few people got to do meaningful things. And yet today, there's much more of a mixture between meaning and money than there ever has been before. Many young people go into careers that are in social entrepreneurship, or they become designers and doing things in ways that are very different than as recently as 10 years ago. And then we all realize that history doesn't remember very much, but it remembers design, it remembers art. It doesn't so much remember business. It remembers business very, very little. But it remembers art and design. And then the last, which is perhaps the most important, is that we have learned that innovation comes from open source. That includes an open society. That includes openness at every level. And if that openness, the debate, the complexity, the contradiction, the heterogeneity is ever put at risk, there can't be innovation. And it's a very, very important part of the general trends. And I include 3 axioms. The first is common sense is common. When somebody tells you this is common sense, it's almost an invitation to look at the opposite. Because what is common sense today, like don't touch screens, is not common sense tomorrow. And secondly, as I implied before, the best vision you can ever have is peripheral vision. And if you can notice what's on the side, and you can look at the edges, that is the vision to have. That is where innovation comes from. And one of the ways to do that, and there really is actually a technique of doing that, if you ever find yourself in a meeting where somebody says, here is the problem, the first thing to do isn't to think about solutions, but to think about how to think about solutions. And to pull yourself up one level and to try and understand things more than what is directly in front of you. And the last remark about simplicity perhaps goes without saying, but if you can make something simpler, you usually want to. And that's a very simple axiom. So I have been doing this so long, I feel that I have made these round trips to the future. And what I mean by that is that I remember when I was very young, I said, in 10 years, this will happen. And of course, 10 years comes. And it either happened or didn't happen, but the 10 years came, and let's assume that it happened. And then you say, in 10 years, this will happen. 10 years pass, and again, let's pretend it happens or doesn't happen, it doesn't really matter which. But you start to feel you've been there many times. And so there's certain things you can say, not so much with authority, but with certainty. So I remember saying, I can actually name the company because it's gone, to the CEO of Kodak, that film is dead. And he thought I was crazy. And he said, that's not possible. We have this enormous film, and we're doing medical films, and we have these little yellow boxes that are all over the world. Of course film isn't dead. But you know that it is. And of course, it's not only dead, but the company's gone. Knew it about CDs. You knew they were going to go away and be replaced by the net. You know it again about books. Physical books will not exist as printed on paper. They just won't. You can be in denial. You can reject that. You can argue with me and say it has 2 years more or 3 years more. But it is as predictable as the sun setting in the west. So there are certain things that you can extrapolate, but there are others that are less certain. So let me ask a question of my host. The clock says I'm out of time in 26 seconds. Is that true? No. Okay, so I will ignore the clock. So I'm going to take you now back through some older projects that are indicators, I think, of innovation, not just in developing countries, which you see here, but at MIT, and I will end my remarks with a proposal for Turkey that is so controversial, they may not let me out of the country tomorrow. But that's my plan in the time that I have. So the first thing I want to share with you is some early work that started just as the Media Lab at MIT was beginning. And it was under a man pictured here named Seymour Papert, who was the last research colleague, research associate of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. And Seymour discovered something in 1968 that was very important. And that was that if children could write and would write computer programs that they could think about thinking that way. And by children, he meant 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And what's very important in writing a computer program, which I hope everybody in the room has done, and if you haven't, you should do, is that in writing a computer program, you have to take a problem, break it into an algorithm, describe that in some kind of code, and execute the code. And when kids did that, and let's say it was to draw a circle on the screen, the kids had to understand circleness. What is a circle? We were all taught at school that a circle was some funny relationship between this number pi, which nobody in the room understands, this number pi and the diameter or the radius. It's just a rule. It's abstract. But if I walk around in a circle, or I have something that's circular, I understand circleness very differently. And when I write a computer program to generate a circle on a screen, I also understand it very differently. And when kids did this, like this child in Senegal, what happens with computer programs is they never work the first time. They don't work. There's a bug. So what do you do when there's a bug? You look at the code, you try to see and understand where you went wrong, you change the code, you execute it again, and maybe or maybe not, it'll work. And if not, you do that again, and finally it works. And guess what? The reason this is so important to innovation, and so important that children do this at a very young age, is that that process that I just described of iterating and changing the code and looking at the behavior of the screen and changing the code and so on is the closest approximation a child can ever get, ever, to learning about learning, because learning itself is that exact same iterative process. And as we make that available, particularly to children in school, you start to get a society that I believe will be extremely innovative. So I'm going to go through some things that date back to as far back as 1968, really just to characterize my own activities, but very, very quickly, because this kind of computer, which was what was available to me in 1968, was about twice the size, maybe 3 times the size of this stage. The stage plus the orchestra pit was the size of the computer. And this was a little piece of hardware in the corner. And I had this computer to myself for 45 minutes every day. And since I had it to myself, and it was a very valuable computer, I would be running. I would put something here, and then I would run across, and put something there, and it was not a cell phone. It was a huge room. And I thought at the time that everybody would use these, not because they would be running back and forth in rooms, but a belief that the price and size would go down. I don't think in 1968 I quite knew that they would go down as fast as they have, but they would go down. And a few years later, I said, well, maybe that room that used to be a terminal. I'm not in front of a terminal, I'm in it. And so, and this goes back still 30 years, could we build computers that we were in instead of in front of? And we built them. This was at a period when, in the United States, the major innovative funding was coming from the military. For better or for worse, it was military funding because they were interested in the most advanced technologies. So this sort of thing got built. We did things that, again, were considered so stupid. When we put a picture of a television set on the screen and put the controls in a little touch-sensitive side display, people said, that is so stupid. We did it with calculators, we did it with all sorts of things, and it became, I'm not sure if you can see in the distance there to the gentleman's right, it's the world's first desktop metaphor. And on that screen there was even a calculator. And when you touched the calculator, it appeared, and you could do the calculations. And again, people said that's so stupid. So usually, and keep this in mind, when somebody tells you your work is so stupid, that is often a badge of honor. And take that as a sort of a recommendation. So we decided to go one step further. You're now inside the computer, but you can talk to it, you can gesture to it, and you know, it's a floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall display. Now, there's one piece of the story which is almost irrelevant, and that is that this is 35 years ago. And that particular room cost about $3 million to produce. But the job of a place like MIT or the Media Lab is to do these things without cost in mind, no concern for cost. Is it possible at any cost? Is it usable? Is it interesting? And then if the answers to those questions becomes yes, then let's worry about bringing the cost down. And the cost, of course, did come down. And one of the things that did not follow in this particular innovation was the idea of concurrency and speech, that you could talk to a computer about something that was on the screen. And that is still fallen behind. Speech is not as widely used as I would have guessed, but it will get more and more. So when these, and I'm going to skip ahead and go to sort of part two, MIT is a very open academic institution. It is so open that departments are like Swiss cheese. They have holes in them. And I can be the thesis advisor of any student. People move pretty freely from department to department. It's not silos. But the various departments had certain faculty who were misfits. Misfits in that faculty. There was a misfit in mathematics, there was a misfit in physics, there were a few misfits in film and graphic design, and I said, I'll take the misfits. I will take those faculty, literally, and we'll create something called the Media Lab. No two faculty, we built a building, this is 30 years ago, and filled this building up with the misfits. And what happened over the next 15 years is that it grew 50% per year. It grew into such a big lab. I'll go through it very quickly. We actually built, a second building to house them. But it was frictionless. There was no friction. There were no meetings where somebody said, you can't do that, or you can't do this, or no friction whatsoever. Why was there no friction? Academic institutions always have friction. Well, it had no friction because nobody wanted the misfits. Nobody wanted them back. So you say, okay, well, you take them back. And no. So we were allowed to do our work without any disruption from the administration, from financial people. Now, there's a little secret that or an admission I should make. My partner in founding the Media Lab had been the president of MIT. So it's a little bit like speeding down a highway and a policeman stops you for speeding and looks in the car and you have a gorilla in the front passenger seat. And the policeman looks at the gorilla and says to you, oh, okay, keep speeding. So that did help the frictionlessness. The second thing we believed is that innovation was going to come from the applications. And this was considered heresy. This was considered ridiculous. And yet, if we look at the history of various media as they've been invented over time, you can look at two very different examples. Television was invented by engineers, and at a certain point in time was handed over to people to be used. In sharp contradiction, photography was invented by photographers. As people wanted to do something different in capturing images, they invented something to do that. So I'm being a bit general, but if you look at photography and how it evolved since the 1800s when it first started, and how, whether it was resolution or motion or color or other things, it was really an imperative driven by the applications. And my belief back then, and still today, is that the applications will drive the innovation, because people will want to do things that are somewhat impossible. And that artists can break engineering deadlocks is perhaps obvious, and being interdisciplinary is also obvious. So we grew and we grew. And now I want to tell you a parallel story. After the early work that I had done with Seymour Papert, I became involved in Cambodia with a few schools and villages that had no electricity, no water, and built a school, connected them to the internet, put in electricity, and gave the kids laptops in 2001. And the kids took the laptops home, which, remember, don't have electricity, but the battery would be good enough for the whole night of use of the laptop. And the parents loved it. And the parents loved it because it was the brightest light source in the house. It was the only light source in the house. And I thought, wow, there's a metaphor and reality, and can we generalize it? And I looked at this picture. I looked at this picture and I said, what in this picture will not happen through normal market forces? And let me just open a parenthesis here. Not everybody in this room has to do what I'm about to say. But I can tell you, when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself one question. Will normal market forces do what I'm doing today? And if yes, stop. So if normal market forces are going to do it, you don't need me. Normal market forces will do it. What would normal market forces not do in this picture? Normal market forces would lower the cost of communications, normal market forces would bring electricity, would deal with power, whether it's solar power, or whatever. But normal market forces in 2001 were not going to lower the cost of that laptop. And it wasn't an issue of innovation, it was an issue of market forces and corporate interests. Commercial process, not innovation. So here the innovation, which I usually think of as technical and invention and scientific, here the innovation was to take the credibility of MIT, of myself and so much as I had in it, and put my foot down and say, okay, we're going to make a $100 laptop for kids in the developing world. And that's when I started something called One Laptop Per Child. I don't want to use too much time talking about it, but it was, again, the innovations came from the application once we got started, and how do you build a laptop that you can crank, that you can use, you can be connected, and have all of the functions of a $1,000 laptop. And I made a lot of enemies. Microsoft and Intel spent a great deal of time and money fighting me publicly and privately. But 3 million laptops later, it made a point. I did it with the United Nations and can talk for hours about this. But the piece I want to get to is what it has done in those countries. A few countries have saturated the country. Where every single child in the country has one of these little green laptops. Today, it means every child from 5 to 18. So, it turns out the countries that are saturated aren't big ones yet. Biggest is Uruguay, which is about 600,000 children, but it's nonetheless large enough to have a sample of saturation. And what that will do to the society is to be seen. But the most heartwarming experience I had with these 3 million laptops were the children who were teaching their parents how to read and write. 6, 7-year-old children. I don't have a better story. Teaching their parents and teaching their grandparents. A complete inversion of what we normally think, where education is the transmission of knowledge to children by adults. We suddenly saw it going in the other direction, and it did not destroy the parent-child relationship, it made it stronger. And these kids are fearless, absolutely fearless. Imagine a society with 100% fearless kids. Well, that's not going to happen, but even if it's 50%, it's a very, very different society. And it comes from control. Look at the expression on that girl's face. The engagement with whatever she's doing is so extraordinary, but she's also accustomed to control, to touching, in this case, a keyboard. We now look at 2-year-olds using iPads. Any self-respecting 2-year-old who has spent 20 minutes with an iPad knows how to use it. And when we see that, and we see 2-year-olds doing it, we don't realize the sense of control that they have. We didn't grow up with that sense of control. We read a book. There was something static. You got out of the book what you could. You talked about the book, but you didn't have the same sense of control. And that is going to have a huge impact going forward, creating a creative society. Because what you want is a creative society. And that's the most important thing anybody can strive for. So let me go through these and get to sort of the last two parts very quickly. The third part is really some notes to myself, because I didn't want to forget them, and then get to my big suggestion. First of all, today is an era where ownership is actually changing. Young people, I'll give you an example. A faculty member at the Media Lab had 40 students in his class. He asked them recently, how many of you want to own a car? Not one hand went up. Not one. How many of you want to own a house? One or two hands went up. Ownership in a shared economy is a very different animal. And when you started talking about things like self-driving cars, we are going to make 10% of the vehicles we're currently making. And we should only make 10%. And you're not going to want more than 10%, because the 10% are going to have a different duty cycle. We won't own them. We'll share them. And so that is such a big change. The second is suburbs. Nobody's going to want to live in suburbs. No young person is going to want to live in suburbs. Now, maybe I'm talking about the United States right now, but it's a bellwether. 30 years ago, everybody went to the suburbs because it was safe, because it had some open space, because it had a little cleaner air, and because the ridiculous American education system is funded by real estate taxes. So clearly it's going to be better where the real estate taxes are higher. All of that's changing. Young people want to be where the creative energy is. That's the city. Young people want to be where they don't have to own cars and there's life at the bottom of the apartment or on the street or something. So suburbs are toast. And then there is, this isn't such good news, but I just want to mention it only as a balance. Now, in the introduction, it was said that I've funded 40 startups. In fact, I funded about 75 startups. That's not my point. My point is that I've been doing that, I work in that area a lot, trying to help people start companies. But it's gone to such an extreme, there's a bit of a global brain drain. And by that I mean that so many kids are starting companies. And very often these stupid little apps to do some stupid little thing, that you say, wait a minute, the brain energy available globally to work on big, hard, long-term problems has in fact gone down. 20 years ago, I could look at, again, I'll use the Media Lab, we graduated about 50 PhD and master's students per year, and I would say out of the 50, 25 went on to work on hard, long-term problems. Today it's probably 1 or 2. The others start companies and do things and so on. There is a funny kind of brain drain. It'll change, these things are cyclical. So I just wanted to point that out and then end with what I'm currently doing. and maybe talk about some of the innovations that is to connect everybody. You want to connect people for all sorts of reasons. One of them is point of view, one of them is of course learning. It's human potential and connectivity are synonymous. A disconnected, isolated society is the worst. So you want the opposite of isolation, so whatever you want to call that word, if it's not connectivity. Then how do you connect the last billion? When I say the last billion, that doesn't include too many people in Turkey. So I'm not obviously referring to Turkey. I'm referring to the hard problem which exists in many places where there isn't electricity, there isn't. And why am I interested in that kind of connectivity? Because it's the hardest one. It's the hardest one for which you need a technical solution. You need to do more than just change some regulatory regime or change some pricing structure. So when I look and I go to places that are really remote and try to connect them, I'm looking at a problem that has as a background a 100% illiterate society. And again, not because that's common, but because it's the hardest problem. And what I did, and I'll go through the experiment very quickly, and this is an experiment. This is not a massive project like one laptop per child. And in this experiment, we took tablets and we dropped them off in villages, like this village, with no literacy, no electricity, no cell phone, no nothing. And we left the tablets in closed boxes with no instructions, none. And we left as many tablets as there were children. The only thing we did in intervention was to go in the night before and show one adult how to use a solar panel that could be used to charge a car battery that could charge the tablet. Now the only difference with these tablets in the boxes is that they were hot. And by that I mean that when you touched them, it would record where you touched, when you touched, what app you were in, how long it was on, how long it was off. And so it recorded and took pictures and provided a complete record of how the tablets were used. And the important result, because we sent somebody into the village after 2 weeks to swap the SIM cards, the important result is that the children took less than 5 minutes to turn them on. Mind you, this is not a society that's ever seen an on-off switch. It took them 5 days to use 50 apps per child per day. It took them 2 weeks to sing ABC songs, and it took them 6 months to hack Android. These kids hacked Android in 6 months. We know exactly which kid, why they did it, what they were doing, and so on. That's the important part. And I want to show you what is perhaps the best slide I've ever had in my whole life. It's not a great slide photographically, but the content, I've never had such a good one. The kid on the right has nominated himself as teacher. Remember, there's no school, there are no teachers, there are no literate adults. And kids sitting there, look at the one on the left using the tablet of the kid to his left. That kid is using the tablet to the kid to his left, and so on and so forth. The collaborative kind of learning that's happening, self-learning, while I'm not saying this is the best alternative and we shouldn't have schools, trust me, when schools come to this village, which may or may not happen for the next 10 years, those kids will be extraordinary students. So when I saw this, I said, how can we scale this, again, for the whole world? How can we connect the world? And I won't go into the details, but here's the key. Can you look at connectivity as a human right? No matter how you answer that question, the instant it is posed, it changes the way you think about connectivity. Because suddenly connectivity means you're entitled to it simply by the fact of being human. Now, there's lots of issues about human rights, and I'm not trying to get into those as much as saying, can we change the nature of connectivity? And so this gets me to my controversial suggestion. People invite speakers like me to come and to be a little provocative. So let me be provocative. Because no country has ever done what I'm about to suggest. But if you could do it, it would make you absolutely unique and change the future of Turkey. And that is, make connectivity in the internet free. And then I'll get off the stage before I run out of the country. When you go out on the street after the speech, you walk out of the building, that street is free. Rich people drive on the street, poor people drive on the street. You walk on the street. The more you walk on the street, you don't pay more. If you're a frequent pedestrian, infrequent pedestrian, a visitor, when I go to my hotel room, they charge me for the internet, but not the soap. Our society is really screwed up when we think of connectivity. It should be free. And it's something that if a society could do it as a nation, and keep in mind when I say that, I think education should be free, and it is in many places, and it is in but when education is free, people make money building the schools, teachers earn salaries, there's an economics that goes on. And that economics, just because the street is free, or the connectivity is free, the economics are called civil society. And to me, the worst word in innovation, the worst term that is used is sustainable. And the reason the word sustainable worries me is because people mean it in a very tight loop. What they mean is, like the work I want to do, launch a satellite, make half the satellite commercial, and it funds the other half of the satellite that is free service. And that's sustainable. It's sustainable in a very small, not that bad an idea, but it's a very small way. A bigger kind of sustainable is the sustainable you want by policy. You want the government, you want participation in society, is you want whatever it is, whether it's education, connectivity, satellites, to create a more productive, a more wealthy, a more sort of contributive society that does what? Yes, pay taxes and civil society. In other words, you want a bigger economic floating and growth, not necessarily the typing. So, in that sense, I would make internet free as soon as possible to everybody in Turkey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I have a few questions for you? Thank you very much. It's a really great presentation. I think we have some other issues in Turkey. Of course, we need a free internet, but we need also free press, free speech, and more freedom. Stephen Hawking has a speech a few days ago, and he's saying that the development of the artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. What do you think about it?
You know, the development of mechanical machines stronger than us didn't destroy the human race. So the development of cerebral machines stronger than us is not going to destroy the human race. There's no correlation between the two. Already today, computers can do many kinds of thinking that you and I can't. And we also know that collectively, our intelligence collectively, is so much more powerful than our collective intelligence individually. So if in that collectiveness are machines as well as people, even mostly machines, so what?
And one more question. When we enter a restaurant, or even when we are sitting with our friends, everybody is using their laptops, iPhones and phones, and nobody's talking to each other. What do you think about the future of this miscommunication?
You know, when laser printers were invented, this goes back a long time, the first laser printers that came out, people started seeing that you could change font, you could do this thing. So they started printing documents that had 30 fonts, big sizes, little sizes, ugly, ugly papers. When somebody gets a movie camera for the first time and they're using it, they move the camera too much. It takes time for a society to stop moving the camera, to realize that you can do graphically very wonderful documents. We're in an era where everybody's moving the camera, by analogy. People are using it and do it. I use it all the time, but I find myself, not that I'm any better than other people who are using it too much, I find myself doing things in the interstices of time that allow me to spend much more time with my family, much more time with the people I enjoy spending time with, and in fact, much better time. And little things. So yes, I see people who spend more time with their phones than each other, especially when it's a young couple in a restaurant. Oh, we should be talking to each other. Yes.
First dates.
Right. But, you know, I think that's an initial phenomenon. I don't think it'll be so true in 3 or 4 years. I think we'll get better. We'll get back to the face-to-face.
My last question is about the using of this computer. I have a 3-year-old son, and everybody has an idea about how many hours he has to spend time with the...
Unlimited.
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 Is it okay?
Okay.
Evet, müthiş bir sunumdu. Şimdi böyle devam edeceğiz. Kısa bir kahve arası.